My name's April Lindgren, and I'm an associate professor here at the Ryerson School of Journalism and academic director of the Ryerson Journalism Research Center. On behalf of the organizing committee, my colleagues Asma Malik from Ryerson and Jagris Hodson from Royal Roads, and the team of staff and student organizers who are working here this weekend, welcome to Is No Local News Bad News? Local Journalism and Its Future. Please join me in acknowledging that we are gathered here today in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We're thrilled to see so many scholars, journalists, students, and concerned citizens register for the conference. And also come here this morning for the 2 sessions before noon that are open to the public. Local journalism has always and still does matter. In Canada, local news played an important role in keeping people informed during and after major evacuations caused by the massive 2013 Calgary flood and last year's devastating fire in Fort McMurray. Across the country and elsewhere, local journalists are working flat out, holding power accountable, telling heartening and heartbreaking stories that bring people together. And of course, they're also hoping that some animal will escape from the local zoo and generate great front page copy. Now, that's a personal favorite of mine, so I'm just going to take a sidetrack here to introduce you to a big animal story in Toronto to show you the role of local news here. As soon as I find my slides. So, last summer, for instance, there was the great capybara escape, and it brought Torontonians together as we were highly entertained by the ability of these South American rodents to outsmart their High Park zookeepers and every citizen around who was trying to chase them up and collect them, find them. It became known as Bonnie and Clyde. And citizens from far and wide, and I mean far and wide, that's like lots of kilometers between those sightings, reported that they were there, that they had seen these guys. And politicians, of course, could not resist jumping on the bandwagon. And there was actually even some news. So before it was done, it all cost 15 grand, and the total cost of buying these 2 little guys from a Texas breeder was $700. And as it turns out, of course, they really are a gift that keeps on giving when it comes to local news. So yes, I do love a good animal story. But as I suspect most of you in this room know, there's really not a lot to laugh about in local newsrooms these days. The era of doing more with less has given way, and now local media in many cases is just doing less with less. So our goals in organizing this conference were to bring people like you together to generate public awareness about what's happening in local news, spark an informed debate about how to address the disruption in the sector, to share and advance knowledge about the state of local news and the best practices for improving citizens' access to the information that they need to live full, engaged lives and influence the decisions that affect them in the places where they live. And finally, we also wanted to create opportunities to discuss possible research collaborations to advance our understanding of what's going on and how best to address the challenges that face local journalism. The strength of this weekend's program, of course, though, is due to the many people who responded to our call for papers. As a result of your work, enthusiasm, and smarts, over the next 2 days, you're going to have the opportunity to hear discussions ranging from the nature of local news in a digital age and models for financing local journalism to issues related to crime coverage and coverage of local stories involving Indigenous people. In addition to receiving funding for this endeavor from the Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada, Ryerson University has been extremely generous in providing support for our gathering this weekend. So I'd like to invite Charles Davis, the Associate Dean for Scholarly Research and Creative Activities for our faculty, the Faculty of Communication and Design, to say a few words. Charles.
Thank you. April didn't tell me that we would be telling capybara stories this morning, so I didn't bring my slides. But I did live in that part of the world for a while, and there's an alternative story down there. It's not the capybaras that are rampaging, it's the Canadian beavers. So I'm here to welcome you to this event. We're really very pleased that you came. The the Ryerson Journalism Research Center is hosting it. They always put on and host excellent events, cutting edge as well as very relevant and practical. So that's what we can expect from this event. I gather from the title, is no news, bad news, that it is bad news. So we've kind of already reached that conclusion. But I would like to know what are the possible remedies. And I see, looking at the conference agenda, that a number of people will be speaking to that. It's not just a negative diagnosis of the situation, but what is to be done about it. I understand that one of the really important instruments to track local news deserts is April's project, and I guess others are involved too, but it's because it's crowdsourced. It's crowdsourced across the country. Whenever there is a failure of a local news outlet, people can put it on the map, and the map has been growing dramatically over the past few years. So this has created, I think, a lot of awareness about the crisis in local news, but there still is a question in my mind, is the local news crisis news? So it's not just is no news bad news, but is no news news? And I hope to learn a lot more about that during the day. Thank you again for coming. On behalf of the Faculty of Communication and Design at Ryerson University, I welcome you, and I hope you have a really useful and insightful conference.
Okay, so before we move into our first panel, I have a few announcements to make. The first is that we will be recording all of the presentations and panel sessions and posting the videos online after the conference. We're doing this to disseminate knowledge about the discussions that we're having as far and wide as possible, and also so that if you can attend one of the sessions, you can watch it afterwards online. Clips from the videos might also be used for the feature video stories that we will produce this summer for inclusion in the multimedia publication that we have planned based on the research presented at the conference. If you do have any concerns about the videos, please see me and we can sort it out. Now, about that multimedia publication, Asma Malik and Jagris Hodson, they'll be moderating the next two sessions, so you will have a chance to meet them this morning, are going to talk more about this tomorrow at the end of the day. But we have posted a call for papers on the conference website, so if you're interested, so if you are presenting a paper today or tomorrow, we hope that you will consider contributing. Now, we're taking a bit of a flyer with this publication in that our plan is to produce an online multimedia a publication that will contain elements ranging from videos to interactive maps and graphics. As I say, our goal is to produce an open source publication that will also reach out and be accessible to members of the public who are interested in becoming informed about this issue and what's happening in local news, as well as to the scholarly community. So it's an experiment, and I really hope that you will consider being a part of it. And while I'm on the topic of experiments, we're also experimenting in some other ways as well. We do have plenty of traditional scholarly panels in the lineup today and tomorrow, but in some cases we've organized what are called lightning talks. So the idea of these talks is that participants will make very short presentations and then engage in a moderated conversation, kind of like pundits on a TV panel. And then the session, of course, will open up to more general questions from the audience. So, okay, truthfully, we actually have no idea how this is going to work. But I do want to say a big thank you in advance to the adventurous souls who have agreed to be presenters and also who have agreed to moderate these sessions. So again, thank you. We're also experimenting with the organization of tomorrow's working lunch. We heard from many of you that you're interested in opportunities to network and meet with your counterparts. So we dreamt up this idea of what we're calling a networking lunch. And here's how it's going to work. If you want to discuss with have an idea you want to discuss with colleagues, please reserve a table by putting your name and the topic on one of the big sheets of paper we have down on the easels, that will be down on the easels in the area where you got coffee this morning. The idea is that other people who are interested in this topic can then sign up to sit at the table with you tomorrow at lunch. Alternatively, if you and a group of colleagues have an idea that you want to work on or develop, then please also list your topic on the easel, put down your names, and we'll make sure that we have a table for you. If there are any extra spots at your table, others who aren't committed will be able to join you by signing up in advance or just joining your table tomorrow if there's any space left. So just to be clear, you don't have to sign up for a table. You can sign up if you want in advance with a topic, or you can just leave things to serendipity, come to the lunch and grab an empty chair at a table where it sounds like there's a topic that will be of interest. Again, this is an experiment. And the only thing I can say for sure is that there will be food and there will be seats for everyone. I mean, really, what could go wrong with leaving it to a group of journalists and journalism professors to actually organize themselves? I can't imagine. We also have a student newsroom running during the conference. Reporters will be live tweeting most of the sessions, and they may dragoon you for an interview in studio or just in the hallway. Again, these interviews will be used for the feature stories students are preparing to complement the the scholarly publication, and also for news that we're producing out of the conference. Just a note for moderators for each panel. First of all, thank you for taking on the job. And if you could end your session about 10 minutes, each session about 10 minutes early, that will give people a bit more time to get their coffee and have a break before the next session starts and help us to run on time. There's one correction in the program. The session called On the Beat, Police and Local News, it's on Sunday at 10:45, will actually be moderated by Chris Waddell from Carleton University. And presenters, please show up early to load your PowerPoints and your presentations if you, so that we can, again, try to keep on time. There will be a student tech expert in each room if you have any difficulties who can help you out. And finally, we have some books to give away. So Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen, director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford, couldn't make it to the conference, but he very generously donated 30 copies of his book, the book he edited called Local Journalism, The Decline of Newspapers and the Rise of Digital Media. So we have these to give away. So we were thinking about running some contests or competitions, but then thought, okay, there's too many experiments happening already. So the first round of giveaways are going to go to the first 5 people who registered for the conference on the website, because we didn't have to nag you to actually come and register. So the winners are, and you can pick up your books downstairs from Emma, the book maven, at the book table in the reception area. The first person was Shoei Chu, is a journalist, Phil Lamera from Beach Metro News, Anna Killen from Beach Metro News, Genevieve Bonin from the University of Ottawa, and Buffy McGaw from Global News. As I say, you can see Emma downstairs for the book. We also decided to give books to the first 5 people who registered this morning because, well, they're just early birds and they deserve a prize. So the winners are Christy Hess from Deakin, Michelle Ferrier from Ohio University, Janice Paskey from Mount Royal, Mary Lou Tyro, a journalist who's attending the conference, and Diana Pereira from City TV. So just stop by and see the book table and you'll get your books. So that leaves 20 left. So here's what we're going to do. If you're registered to attend the conference and you tweet using the conference hashtag, hashtag localnews17, Emma is going to choose tweets that catch her fancy, and she is going to direct tweet you to tell you you have won a book. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, and I just want to say Emma is absolutely fearless and uncorruptible. So bribes won't work, and neither will threats. You're just going to have to wait and see if she chooses your tweet in particular. Okay, so I think that's about it, and I'm going to turn things over to Jagris Hodson from Royal Roads, who is moderating the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you, April, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're all very excited to have you. My name is Jagris Hodson, and I'm the program head of the Master of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies at Royal Roads University. It's also my great honor to be on the organizing committee for this conference. So today, we're going to start with our first panel, which is Understanding Local Journalism and Overview. And the goal of this panel is really to provide a bit of an overview of the state of local news in different jurisdictions around the world, and also to provide a taste of the different approaches into research, into what's going on, what is the impact, maybe what can we do about it, and hopefully there'll be some little bits of rays of hope in there too. So I'm very proud to introduce April Lindgren, Colette Bryn, Damien Radcliffe, and Michelle Ferrier, who will be on our panel today. Now, April Lindgren is our own from Ryerson University, and I still say ours because even though I'm at Royal Roads University now, I spent many years here at Ryerson University, it still feels like home. And Charles, I'm looking to come back here, just so you know. Associate Professor April Lindgren is the academic director of the Ryerson Journalism Research Center and our fearless leader in this conference. She's also the principal researcher for the Local News Research Project at Ryerson University's School of Journalism, and her research has examined the role of ethnic media in providing information for newcomers. More recently, her work on local news poverty explores the extent to which local news outlets provide timely access to verified news about local politics, the economy, education, and other information essential to an informed public and well-functioning communities. Colette Bryn from Université Laval is a professor in the Department of Information and Communication at Université Laval in Quebec. She's director of Le Centre d'études sur les médias, I'm sorry, I butchered that, which is currently documenting changes to Quebec's media landscape. And Colette's research interests include ongoing transformation of journalistic practices, journalist professional discourse, local journalism, and political journalism. She's also worked as a researcher with Radio Canada, and her project is Mapping News Ecosystems in Quebec, 2011 and 2016. Damien Radcliffe is from the University of Oregon and Cardiff University. He's the Carolyn S. Chambers Professor in Journalism at the University of Oregon and a fellow of the Tow Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia. He's also a research fellow at Cardiff University's School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies, and a fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce in London, UK. Damien is a regular contributor to publications including BCC Academy, CBC Interactive, Huffington Post, and Media Shift, and he writes about digital trends, technology, the business of media, and the evolution of journalism. Damien has also worked in editorial research and policy positions for the past 2 decades, including roles at the BBC, Volunteering Matters, and Qatar's Ministry of Information and Communications Technology. And his presentation today will examine the similarities and differences of local news provision in the American and British markets. And last but not least, Michelle Ferrier from Ohio University is the Associate Dean of Innovation Research and Creative Activity and Graduate Studies, also an Associate Professor of Journalism at Ohio University's Scripps College of Communication. Michelle worked as a newspaper editor before this and saw how changing media ecosystems have forced some newspapers to lay off personnel or shut down completely. This has led to media deserts where local news is lacking, she says. Michelle is studying this issue with the Media Deserts Project, and through this project she has mapped the circulation of all of the daily national newspapers in the US and is currently analyzing weekly alternative and community media. I'm very proud of this prestigious and wonderful panel. We're very excited to have them here. Each person will have about 15 minutes to give their presentation, and then we're going to open it up for questions. When you ask your questions, we're just going to ask that you come down to the microphone here on my right and your left-hand side and line up to ask your questions. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce April, who is our first presenter today.
Thank you, Jagris. I'm going to provide a brief sketch of the state of local news, and Allison's going to find my PowerPoint here, because I'm going to talk a bit about the state of local news in Canada, and then talk about my research on what we call local news poverty. So as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, there's still a lot of good local journalism being done in this country. You'll hear that in the next panel how the Toronto media played an important role in changing the practice of random police stops. In Thunder Bay, CBC journalist Jody Porter is winning awards for her coverage of the Indigenous community, including the deaths of First Nations students in that city. And this year's Canadian Community Newspaper Award winners include reporters who covered flash floods, wrote stories about people learning Arabic in their communities in anticipation of the arrival of Syrian refugees, and of course covered the fentanyl crisis in smaller communities. And poll after poll does suggest that Canadians really do care about local news. In a survey last fall by the Public Policy Forum, 92% of respondents said news about their communities was either very important or somewhat important. 69% said that they would consider it a serious consequence if there's less coverage of local news due to a decline in Canadian news gathering organizations. The same poll, though, incidentally, found that nearly half of respondents were unaware that the news business was in trouble, and it also pointed to a limited appetite for government intervention to help out the news industry. The forum's Shattered Mirror report also concluded darkly that while Canadians value news, they just don't want to pay for it, or just are not willing to pay for it. And so the local news landscape in Canada really isn't a pretty sight. The 2008 recession was a turning point that marked the beginning of troubles that will sound familiar to those of you from other jurisdictions. The broadcast regulator has expressed concern about an alarming number of television stations that have had cutbacks to their newscasts. And there are ongoing concerns about the viability of the Post media chain, with its 15 large market dailies, 27 smaller market dailies, and 122 non-daily community newspapers. Reports of news organization cutbacks and closures, meanwhile, are all too common. The latest statistics on our local news map, which Charles mentioned earlier, it's a project I created with my research associate, John Corbett, identifies nearly 200 closures of local news media of all types in 150 communities since 2008. By comparison, the map documents only about 60 new outlets. And among these new outlets, digital news sites are sparsely represented, in part, I think, because restrictive charity laws discourage the philanthropic investment that's fostering experimentation in other jurisdictions. That's just one reason. Increasingly in Canada, policymakers, however, and others are raising concerns about what's going on. So the state of local media has been the subject of hearings by the House of Commons Heritage Committee, explored in think tank reports like the one I mentioned earlier, and discussed at the CRTC, the broadcast regulator, in terms of what's happening with local television and radio. This awakening, if I can call that, has coincided with the realization that we actually don't know a lot about what's really happening on the ground. Carleton University professor Dwayne Winsack made this point when he warned the Heritage Committee that when it comes to changes in the Canadian media landscape, there are, as he put it, a lot of opinions and little data to act upon. So it's in this context that we're investigating what we call local news poverty, that is trying to understand the extent to which local news media are meeting the information needs of communities, particularly places outside of Canada's major media hubs. Our work has three key objectives. The first was to create a tool that tracks changes in local news systems, and this is the crowdsourced map that John Corbett will present later today at the Innovation Bazaar this afternoon. We're also interested to know whether social media and digital-only news sites are picking up the slack left by traditional news organizations. And that's the work that JGRIS is doing, and we'll discuss on a panel tomorrow morning. And then finally, we wanted to investigate the extent to which some communities have better access to local news than others, identify the characteristics of places that are poorly served, and use that information to try and get a better handle on what can be done to try and fix it. So it's that study that I'm going to talk about today. So we set out to determine how well local news outlets are addressing one critical information need in particular, and that is the civic and political information people need to cast an informed vote. And to do this, we looked at how local news outlets covered races for Member of Parliament in the 2015 federal election. Studying the local coverage was really a natural experiment in that it was a chance to examine and compare the same event and how it was covered across the country by local media at the same time. Our content analysis generated variables that include how well local media performed in 8 places that we studied. And each variable tells a slightly different story. So to make sense of all those variables, we've combined them into an index that allows us to rank the places according to their level of local news poverty. And armed with this index, we're now exploring why some places are more poorly served than others. That is, we're looking at places where news poverty is most pronounced, and we're working on creating what I'm calling a diagnostic checklist of news poverty risk factors. Does income help explain what's going on in a weak local news ecosystem? Is it maybe the presence or the absence of a CBC public broadcasting station? Does it have to do with ownership? Our idea is that this diagnostic checklist can be used as a shortcut to determine if a place is at risk of local news poverty and save us from having to constantly do time-consuming, costly content analysis studies, which in the end are really untenable. We're hoping that a better understanding, as I said, of the risk factors for news poverty will contribute to a development of more specific targeted solutions. So I'm going to take you through a look at what the variables are that we included in the index, and then talk about the diagnostic checklist for a minute. So we gathered data on local reporting in 8 places. The list includes some suburban communities, one rural one, and a range of smaller cities, and each with different sorts of media systems, some with a CBC public broadcasting presence, others without, one where there's been the closure of major media outlets like a newspaper, others that seem to have a more robust system. What did we find? Well, the first thing we did was we looked at the number of news outlets in each of these places. And first, just let me say that for all of these variables, we owe a major debt of gratitude to Phil Napoli's work at Duke University, which gave us, basically told us what to do and how to do it. So it was very hugely useful, and thank you, Phil. The first step was to, as I said, to identify the number of news outlets. And this side, of course, shows that there were significant differences in the places. We charted the number of news outlets per 10,000 voters. And as you can see, Brampton, which is a big suburban city outside of Toronto of about 500,000 people, had only 3 choices. Voters there had 3 choices for information. At the other end of the spectrum were voters in Kamloops, where they had access to 9 local news sources reporting on the race for Member of Parliament. The next thing we looked at was, after identifying the news outlets, we identified the stories that were published about the local race for Member of Parliament in the month leading up to the election. That amounted to about 770 locally generated stories about the race and what went on as the contest for Member of Parliament continued. Again, you can see significant differences in the number of stories per 10,000 electors, depending on where people lived. So yeah, Brampton and Oakville, 2 suburban ridings, had the least access to news about the election as it was playing out in their communities. And City of Kawartha Lakes, which is a really badly named name for a sprawling rural municipality that consists of a bunch of little communities, it was down on the lower end of things too. And again, you have the small to medium-sized cities performing a little bit better. I do want to point out that the situation has actually deteriorated in a couple of communities since we collected this data. In Nanaimo, which is 4th on the list you'll see here, the local daily newspaper, which published 57 of, or about half of the election coverage, local election coverage, actually closed after the election in January 2016. And in Kamloops, newskamloops.ca, it's a digital site, and it published 36 local election stories, or about a quarter of all the coverage in that for readers in that community. It also closed in October 2016. I mention these because now when people talk about how difficult it is to know what's lost when a local news outlet closes, we at least have this piece of concrete data that we can point to. Another measure of how vibrant a local news ecosystem is the extent to which people can get their news from a variety of sources. And to get at this, we also again followed Phil Napoli's lead and used the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index from economics to measure media concentration. So the lower the number is to 0, the more one news outlet dominated the coverage in the community. That's what this slide shows, but I think actually this tells the story more reasonably. I call it a tale of 2 cities. And as you can see from this chart, in Brampton, the Brampton Guardian, the community newspaper published 3 times a week, supplied 43 of the 44 election stories in that community. In Kamloops, by comparison, the coverage was spread more evenly amongst a range of news outlets. So the Kamloops This Week, a community paper, produced 43 stories. That website I mentioned earlier, that's gone now, produced 36. Local TV produced 26. So there's more variety of news sources available to people. We also, the 4th factor we put into our index was the percentage of local election news stories that made it onto the news outlets' Facebook pages. And we decided to include this as an indicator of the extent to which the election news was available for sharing and discussion in the digital public sphere. And here you can see that although voters in Thunder Bay had access to quite a few stories about the local race for MP in terms of absolute numbers, relatively little of that election-related content was making it onto the Facebook sites, the news outlets' Facebook sites, where it could be accessed by people who didn't necessarily read the local paper, watch local TV, or maybe even listen to the local radio. So as you can see, each of these variables tells a little bit of a different story in terms of the rankings. And of course, there's all sorts of different measures. We have some that are percentages, some that are per 10,000. So we needed to create a common way of making sense of this, and that's why we created the index. And the index allows us to generate a single number and rank the communities according to their level of news poverty. And my research assistant, David Rudin, I think is here somewhere, I hope, to explain any math questions you might have. Because we use, of course, the well-known Z-score method, which I have to say is probably well-known to some people, but David and I've been educated on the Z-score method. So as you can see, this is the ranking we get when we combine the variables to create an index. And we weighted each variable equally, which is worth discussing if you're interested in indexes, and we've gone back and forth on. So news poverty was most pronounced in Brampton, the rural municipality of City of Kawartha Lakes, and Oakville, which is another suburb just outside of Toronto. So I just want to shift gears for a minute and talk about the other side of the equation, and that is how did residents in these 8 municipalities feel about the election coverage that they had available to them. And let me say off the top that our polling has many limitations, the main one being that we only had 419 responses for 8 communities. Now, having said that, the results still are kind of interesting. So our question was, in this case, when it came to the race for Member of Parliament in your riding, how good a job did the local media do in providing you with the information needed to cast an informed vote? And overall, in all communities, about half of people, the respondents, said they got most or all of the news they needed. And just over a third said they got none or not much. But here you can see what happened on a community-by-community basis in this slide. The green and the orange segments represent respondents who said local media provided none or not much of the news they needed to cast an informed vote. And the rankings, I think, are going to sound familiar. In Brampton, 70% of respondents said local media provided not much or none of the local news they needed. In Oakville, it was 46%, and City of Kawartha Lakes, it was 42%. The voters in small and medium-sized cities seemed to think they got most or all the information they needed. So the message from the poll, it suggests that people in the communities that we found suffered most from local news poverty knew they were being badly served. So where are we going next? We're now at the point where we're taking a close look at the most poorly served places, and we're working on developing a diagnostic checklist of news poverty risk factors. We're trying to use factors that are, we want the list to be easy so that citizens can do it, researchers can do it, and without having to spend a lot of time analyzing data or collecting data. So it should be readily available data to them. And here's a list of some of the characteristics we're examining. And we're not starting from scratch. There's other hard work by researchers that have helped us with this. Research by Napoli and others have suggested that income can be a factor, maybe proximity to a major media center. In Europe, research has suggested that the presence of a public broadcaster can make a difference because it forces everybody else to up their game. And work by Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen suggests that the local daily newspaper plays a key role in the provision of political news because they still provide the most comprehensive political coverage, and they shape news agendas of other local news media. So this is the list that we're going to start working on. It's not easy, but we're going to work our way through this. And we don't know whether it's going to succeed or not. We're just starting to explore this. A major limitation, obviously, is that we only have 8 communities. So I think that that's may do us in the end. So I'll just conclude by saying that in the meantime, I think the study is useful for other reasons as well. It establishes that political information is available unevenly across the country. I didn't present the data here, but we also have reason to be concerned about the quality of the political reporting. Of those 700, am I supposed to shut up? Oh, sorry, didn't see it. Okay, of the 770 items, there were only 1 or 2, 61% had only 1 or 2 sources, and I'll just stop there. Sorry, honestly, I didn't see the slide. I swear I didn't see it. I've set a very bad example.
No, you were right on time. It was perfect. And besides, she gets all the time she needs as the organizer of the conference. Thank you so much, April. It's my great pleasure to introduce Colette Bryn.
Actually, I would like to see the whole page. Yeah, that's good. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, April, not only for organizing this conference, but also for pushing us forward on this research agenda. I think, sorry, going to go back to the mic. It seems like local news is having a bit of a moment right now. It hasn't been always a fashionable topic to be working on in research. I'm very happy to be talking here about Quebec local and regional media. We usually combine the two categories in Quebec because regional is considered to be more of those media that covered the fairly large rural areas and not only local in terms of towns, cities, neighborhoods. I'm going to use this. So I'm going to be sharing with you early results of a really recent news project we have going at the Centre d'études sur les médias, which in English would be the Center for Media Studies. The center was founded 25 years ago and has done a lot of research on local and regional media over the years. A lot of it has been commissioned by the Quebec government, and some of it was self-commissioned. So I'm very fortunate to be director of the center since 2014. And this is the first really local news project I'm working on since I've been there, but I'm a former local journalist. And also I've done some work on, which I'll be talking about, on staffing of local newsrooms. So this project comes with funding from the Quebec Department of Communications and Culture. And we talk about local news poverty. We could also be talking about local news research poverty or local news data poverty, because what we found in preparing the data set for this study is that the information gathered by government agencies is quite helpful, but not always complete. And it's very hard to go back in time also and see how things are changing. So there has been some interest in recent years from the Quebec Press Council on local news needs and how the communities are served. The FPGQ, the Federation of Professional Journalists in Quebec, has done some documenting of what they call the Black Book of Municipal News, city halls or town halls that don't allow journalists to attend meetings and that kind of thing in communities where there are not a lot of new journalists, and journalists have a hard time just doing their job because institutions are not used to that kind of scrutiny. But all of this is scattered, and not a lot of that information is always public. So why did I look at 2011, 2016? Well, those are census years, of course, but this also corresponds to a period where there were major shifts in news production and consumption in Quebec. So a recent study we did, I'm going to have to use this, right? Oh, there's no arrow that I can, oh, I'm going to have a hard time with the PCs. Sorry, they told me not to do a PDF, and I was bad, so, because the maps don't show up very well on PowerPoint. So we did a study in 2013, which was published in 2013, where we looked at the evolution of newsroom staffing in the large Montreal Francophone newsrooms, where we found that between 28, we started with 2008 because that was the end of the lockout at the Journal de Québec, and also marked some important changes at the French National Newswire, which is Presse Canadienne, the Canadian press. So we looked at that period, which also marked the lockout at the Journal de Montréal, and we expected to find important changes in how newsroom staffs are in numbers, but also in their work, because we found, as expected, that this was a period of not only reductions in staff, but also changes in the kind of work that they do. So they were asked to do more and more multi-platform, multimedia work. So growing pressures on journalists, and also what we call précarisation in French, which is the growing job insecurity and the fact that jobs are not necessarily less numerous in all newsrooms, but also that they were less and less stable. So these were the findings we had in this study. We also found in a separate study that an ongoing study of news audiences in Quebec that I don't know if you can see that very well. Normally, I can make this zoom in on this. I'm sorry, I'm awfully sorry. I'm making your job really hard. So would it be because usually, I'm sorry, I'm a Mac person, and normally there is, yeah, sorry. What's this open in? Oh, okay. This is good. This is good. So, all right. There is. I'm sorry, this print is. All right. So what we see is how news consumption evolved. This is a panel research that we did since from 2007 to 2015. So every 2 years we collect from the same group of people, around 500 people in Quebec, in different regions, what types of platforms they use for news in terms of time spent in minutes on a daily basis. So what you see is the orange line, which of course is digital platforms, which has gone up significantly. And you can see that the main shift has started really in between 2013 and 2015. There was a very sharp rise, and you see that it's surpassed television as a major source of news. So this is all kinds of news, not just local. But you see also that the purple line way down at the bottom is the print weeklies, and the red line is radio, which are main sources of local and regional news. TV and dailies, of course, as well. But in many communities, they're not strong providers of news. So. Yes, quotidien is the dark blue or the darker blue line around the middle, which has gone down. So I think that speaks for itself, and we see the same types of charts everywhere. Perhaps a little slower, a little later in Francophone Quebec because of the language barrier and some technology barriers as well, which shows that we're... So this is why we chose this period. Yes.
Quick question. So when you say the digital media, is that specifically news or even local news?
Not specifically local news, but news. So yeah. So we built this data set, which was a lot more complicated than we were expecting at the initial stages of the study. We thought we would have, we were assured actually that the data sets were complete and clean. And I'm with apologies to anyone from the CRTC or the government that may be in the room. But this is completely normal for anyone who's worked with large data sets, is that you really have to go over every entry and check and verify. And we see there's a lot of things missing. It's just part of the challenge here is what is news, what is local news, what is a media outlet, and all of those questions combined. And finding also the new digital outlets that are not always recorded. And actually, after we started this project, the Quebec government actually mandated us to do a more comprehensive study of the state of the presence of media, not just local, but of news media across the province. So obviously there was a need there. So we just have some very basic information for now, because this is what's available on those sources. No information for now on staffing. But what we're hoping to do is a separate map. It's not ready yet, but based on Statistics Canada data, and also the FPGQ does a census of journalists, which would allow us at least to show how journalists show up in different regions, how numbers of journalists have changed in different regions across the province. So it's a very general early stages of the project. So we hope to someday be as advanced as April is. Okay. So we have it's just 2011 and 2016, so we have the news outlets that opened during that period, that closed during that period, that opened and closed during that period. There are a couple, and those that remained or ongoing since that period, and also mergers, a couple of mergers. Okay. So here is the first map. I'm just going to run through these really quickly so you can see how this information. These are static maps. They're not interactive. So all we have is the presence of blue print media, so all print media. Red are radio, green are TV, and orange are the digital only. As maybe I can zoom in on this a little more. Here we go. Now I got it. So there's not a lot. This is the St. Lawrence Valley, so you can see the most populated areas. Not a lot of orange on that map. These are the weeklies. So the red are the closures. Green are new openings, new weeklies that opened during that period. These are all print. And the orange are the ones that opened and closed during that period, and the blue triangles are, that's not really showing up well. The blue triangles are the mergers. So the red dots are just bigger so we can see the black ones better. It's not, doesn't mean anything. Yes, I'm not sure I'm supposed to take questions during the talk, but go ahead. La Presse in 2016 is considered still a newspaper, but now obviously it's not a newspaper at all anymore. It's kind of an off category. But La Presse is not considered specifically local news, but I think it does show up on the map anyway. But it's considered mostly as a national newspaper in Quebec. Yeah, sorry about that. So we learned just a couple of months ago that Transcontinental would be selling it's putting up for sale its news properties in Quebec. So they're mostly 91 weeklies and the Metro Montreal. And the yellow dots here show all the TC properties that are for sale, 91 of them out of about 200 media outlets, all media outlets, all types of media combined. So you just see the impact of that on many communities that just don't have anything else in terms of news sources. I'm really going over, I'm really sorry. So I'm not going to show you all the local, we have maps for Montreal and Quebec as well. Quebec is actually doing quite well, and so is Montreal, but they're completely atypical in terms of, so basically what we need to do in the next couple of months is to finish the 2011 data set to have all media, not just the weeklies, which were the major losers of this period, and to produce the interactive maps. They're actually quite advanced, but I just didn't want to bring them here. As you see, I'm already having technical issues with this very simple presentation, so I didn't want to make anything crash. And we're going to do some very similar work to what April's been doing, is actually 3 case studies of towns, small, I don't know how large you would consider them to be in Ontario, but in Quebec they're average-sized towns, with 3 types of situations. A robust ecosystem which has maintained a strong media presence, a fragile ecosystem which has been traditionally poorly served in terms of journalism, and in crisis, which means the media presence actually declined in recent years. To see really how communities are responding to this change. Are people feeling the difference? Are people getting their news in other ways? And also, we want to look at this during the context of the upcoming municipal election in Quebec, so we can see also how candidates are disseminating news to the public in this context. So I really need to thank the people who are not here today who have collaborated to this project. 2 PhD students who are working on related issues in their dissertations, Philippe Marcotte and Marie Brunel, and also Jean Dubé and Charles-David Babin from the chair in Regional Development and Planning at Laval, who have done the amazing maps, but I haven't shown you all the interactive and the really amazing stuff they've been doing on StatTrend and StatPlanet, which are open-sourced software that some of you may know about. So sorry about the technical problems. Thank you very much. Look forward to discussing with you.
Thank you, Colette. Very interesting stuff. And thank you, everybody, for being so engaged. That's super cool. But do remember, we will have time for questions after, and we'd like everybody to have the opportunity to present their findings. So next, I am very, very pleased to introduce Damian Radcliffe from the University of Oregon.
Good morning, everybody. Great to be here. Fantastic schedule of speakers and topics, and also great to see some familiar faces in the room and lots of people that I've been following on Twitter for years but never had a chance to meet in real life. So I'm looking forward to making those connections over the course of the next few days. So what I'm going to do really here is talk very quickly and kind of deliberately rattle through a variety of kind of key themes that I think we're going to see emerging. We've already started to see emerging in the first two presentations, and we're going to see more of over the course of the next 36 to 48 hours. So I'm going to throw a bunch of things at the wall, and we'll kind of see what sticks for the Q&A and elsewhere. I wanted to start by kind of pointing out some of the parallels and similarities that we're seeing in terms of the experience for local news and local journalism in the US and the UK. The dialogue will be very familiar already to many of you in Canada as well. So not least the fact that over the course of the last decade, we're seeing considerable reduction in terms of the number of boots on the ground, journalists working in newsrooms, fewer papers and titles, and indeed many of those titles that still exist often producing with decreased frequency or indeed producing smaller publications in terms of the amount of pages and amount of original news that they're producing. Huge amounts of mergers and acquisitions going on in this space. It can be sometimes confusing to kind of keep up to date with who owns what. I know I find that kind of a constant struggle. And of course, dramatic changes over a relatively short period of time in terms of the advertising model, particularly in the digital space, where Facebook and Google are really kind of gobbling up most of the digital ad dollars. But there are some positive signs also within that space. We're seeing the emergence of hyperlocal media in some places, sometimes super serving existing communities, in some cases diving into areas which have been underutilized, where there isn't necessarily a lot of reporting going on. And there is the occasional glimmer of a group like Tyndall newspapers in the UK who are actually opening more titles rather than just simply closing them. That's kind of rare, but it's useful to know that there are some examples of people doing that. So, just to kind of illustrate a few of those themes, fewer journalists and titles. Well, one of the challenges in this space for researchers is the lack of data that we often have access to. Too often, many of the figures that we see that talk about what's happening across titles and in terms of numbers of people employed in newsrooms tend to be aggregated figures. So finding up-to-date data that specifically talks about local can be a real issue. Here's some data from the start of this decade from the UK during the Ryerson inquiry, which shows some pretty stark statistics. 40% of regional press jobs going over the course of the previous 5 years. Rapid shedding at a local level that was not being seen in the same space at the same speed as in the national arena. And of course, classified advertising, once the kind of mainstay of a lot of local newspapers, now pretty much decimated. In the States, similar kind of situation, huge reduction in terms of the number of people working in newsrooms. Again, this is an aggregated figure, so we need to try and do more work in terms of unpacking what that might mean at a local level. And in this chart here on the right, the blue column is people working in newspapers over a period of time, dramatic decline. And although a number of people have moved to the internet and online publishing, which is the green, the kind of slightly lush green color there, as you can see, the two don't balance each other out by any means. In terms of the kind of M&A space, just in the US alone, huge changes in terms of people being bought out, of companies spinning off, particularly their kind of newspaper operations, often from broadcast and other media assets, sometimes renaming and rebranding. So it can be very hard if you kind of casually look at this space, or even if it's more than casual, to try and understand kind of who's going on, who owns what, and what's really happening, simply because of the pace of change at kind of a boardroom level. We mentioned, of course, that the funding model has changed dramatically. We've seen across the UK and the US a real change in terms of the range and diversity and breadth of advertisers that are available. If you go into your newspaper archives and look back at the range and number, the sheer number of local advertisers that you would see, particularly in local newspapers, many of those businesses no longer exist anymore. You know, the rise of Walmart and of e-commerce giants like Amazon have helped to contribute to a dramatic change in terms of the shop presence on Main Street. And of course, we've also seen with Google and social media, and in particular Facebook, the creation of new advertising markets that are more targeted, have a very different kind of payment model to the way in which traditional media has typically served local advertisers. One of the kind of positive things to highlight in this space is, of course, the emergence of some new players, particularly in the hyperlocal space. Sometimes that's people who are coming to this kind of well-funded, with a kind of high profile in this arena. In many cases, particularly if you look at a city like Seattle, it was also in Philadelphia, many of the people who are moving to this space are laid-off print journalists who decide to do something entrepreneurial, who use their redundancy check, their buyout monies to try and do something different. And they're often having kind of flourishes of success, but there are challenges in terms of sustainability in that space, both in terms of energy and financing. And of course, it requires very different skills to be a beat reporter at somewhere like the Philadelphia Inquirer or the Seattle Times to running your own shop. And that's also a really important consideration. So I wanted to kind of highlight a very kind of British book, but Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. And this kind of analogy, I think for many media organizations, they're kind of like this statement from the Red Queen. They're frantically kind of grappling just to stay in the same place, never mind kind of grow their existing market or relationships with audiences. And then what are the differences? Well, there are many differences in terms of definitions, in terms of the types of local markets that we're talking about, particularly in terms of advertising models, and very particular different attitudes towards market intervention and the role of policymakers in this space. Definition of local is a real challenge for us as researchers and also for policymakers, because it's highly personal. Everyone in this room will define local in a very different way, and so that can be very challenging for us. And one of the things that was very striking for me when coming to the States, I live in Oregon, which is a state of just under 4 million people, but geographically it's bigger than the whole of the UK. So I work with people and I know people who might think of Oregon news as local news, whereas that would be national in the UK. Same if you look at somewhere like Wales, and some of my friends and colleagues from the Centre for Community Journalism at Cardiff University are here. Some people think of all Welsh news as local news, but equally you could live in a particular part of Cardiff, the capital of Wales, and say, no, local is this part of Cardiff where I live. So definitions of local, are different and they vary, and that makes it challenging for us to really try and understand what is the problem that we're trying to address, because everybody defines it differently. Within that, big differences in the US and UK markets in terms of local, particularly in terms of the kind of money and scale that's involved. It's really striking, particularly if you look at the hyperlocal space. Even some of the smaller hyperlocals often have more people and more money than some of the biggest ones in the UK, and that's partly as a result of local advertising markets being different. There being a presence of kind of large, vibrant local advertising markets. And that's partly also, of course, driven by the scale of the countries, the size, the geographic size of the countries that we're talking about. You can see that just in these two charts here. So the one here on the left is from the Pew Research Center, looking at the amount of ad revenue produced by local TV stations in the US that produce news, of which there are 833 of them. So just local ad revenue alone for in the TV space was 3 times bigger than the entire TV ad revenue model for the UK. So although there are many similarities in terms of our kind of journalistic approach and also in terms of language, we see very, very different dynamics in terms of our media industries. Some of those dynamics are also very historic. In the UK, back in 2010 and 2011, the then UK government, the coalition government, decided that they wanted to launch a new tier of broadcasting. They said, we're going to bring local TV to the UK, which was not something we'd really had before. And the Secretary of State infamously said, why is it there are no TV stations in Birmingham, the second largest city in the whole of the UK, but Birmingham, Alabama, which has a fraction of the population, has 8 TV stations? Now, you're not comparing like for like, and there are many kind of reasons for that, which include some of the kind of markets that I've already kind of touched on, but also some of the kind of history. What's really striking, again, you come to the States and you see just how long some of the local stations and operations have been around. The journalism chair, the Carolyn S. Chambers chair that I'm fortunate to hold at the University of Oregon. Carolyn Chambers was the woman who, in 1959, bought the cable franchise to bring TV news to Eugene in Oregon, a town that now has a population of 150,000, a lot less nearly 60 years ago. But she was able to make a viable business out of that 60 years ago, whereas here we are in the UK in 2017, and there are only 26 local TV stations that are currently on air. And even in London, the capital, where you'd think there was a heck of a lot of stuff going on, the original license proposal talked about only producing 2 hours of local news per day, which many local operators in the US easily do. And within a very short period of time, they were lobbying the regulator, Ofcom, one of my former employers, to reduce that to 1 hour of local news per day from London. So we also see some different attitudes to intervention. It's been very striking. I'm doing a number of different projects around local newspapers here in the States in particular. And even when you talk to people who might paint a negative image about their future, or they're slightly pessimistic about what might happen to their shop, when you suggest, well, what are the opportunities for policy intervention in this space, they are aghast and horrified at the idea that there could be any form of intervention whatsoever, even if it means that their publication goes to the wall and that their community potentially goes unserved. In the UK, it's a very different story, and in part that's because of the historic legacy of the BBC and the role that it plays, and the role in public funding in providing and buttressing a lot of important local media. But that has been under attack, particularly over the course of the last half decade. We're seeing elements of the BBC license fee being top sliced, so taken off to fund other government projects and initiatives. A bunch of that money, for example, went to support local TV. We also have seen over the course of the last year, $8 million a year set aside from the BBC license fee to go to commercial newspapers to fund people to do the kind of public reporting that they always used to historically do. And this kind of attrition of kind of public money to support what used to be historically done by the commercial sector is only going to continue. And then what about the future? A kind of digital utopia in a world where we're often really trying to work out how do we in particular get young people engaged with local news. We know that young people are extremely passionate about issues, but they're not necessarily traditional news consumers. They consume news in very different ways, and their attitudes towards paying for it, of course, may be very different from our own. But I think there are some good and very valid reasons for optimism within this space, and I want to highlight just two of them. The importance of original reporting that is still produced at a local level, and some really important discussions like some of the ones we're having today and we'll be having at other conferences over the course of the year about the kind of evolution of practice at a local level. From the original reporting perspective, we know that local news continues to fill important knowledge gaps and that can be appreciated by audiences. So the Cottage Grove Sentinel. Cottage Grove is a small town, just under 10,000 people, 20 miles south from where I live. It has just under 10,000 people there, but 5,600 people subscribe to the newspaper, which costs $36 a year for a weekly, which is produced by one person who does every single story. Where there are gaps emerging, like, say, for example, in Port Talbot in Wales, the home of Richard Burton, Martin Sheen, and Sir Anthony Hopkins, when Trinity Mirror decided to pull out of that space, four of the journalists who had been laid off founded their own cooperative and created the Port Talbot Magnet to ensure that there was important news provision was still covered in their locality. And we also know that, of course, not only is local news the kind of glue that binds many communities together, but it's also really important from a historic perspective. And the British Library, as well as collecting newspapers from all around the UK, is also capturing stories and information from local websites as well to ensure that that is archived for future generations. Seeing lots of active discussions around the kind of evolution of practice, particularly in the US, where often unprompted when I'm having discussions with journalists about the role of advocacy, solutions journalism, how important engagement is, and defining that and understanding that in perhaps different ways to the kind of relationship that audiences and newsrooms have had in the past. And of course, we can't, for all that kind of positivity, and there are great discussions about the future of journalism that are going on, particularly at a local level. There are, of course, big structural issues that are not going to go away, and these are, two of them. The funding, we know that, that the kind of ad-led model is not going to be sustainable in the future, and that therefore you need to spread your bets and be involved in as many different types of revenue-raising opportunities as one possibly can be in. And we also know that the local news sector will need to reinvent itself and reinvigorate itself. It's not going to be what it was. If we look back to some halcyon golden age that probably never existed, then we're kind of on a bit of a fool's errand. But that's a real challenge, particularly for many commentators and indeed some people in newsrooms who kind of hark back to an era which has gone. We know that local news is not going to be the same as it once was. There are those 20,000 jobs that have gone in the US, most of them are not going to come back. We are increasingly battling for attention and need to recognize the opportunities to reach out and engage on social and digital platforms with different audiences. Can't ignore that. But equally, we shouldn't ignore, amongst the potential kind of doom and gloom narrative, there's loads of amazing reporting that is still going on every day and every week across the UK, the US, Canada, and elsewhere. We need to do more to celebrate those successes, highlight those stories, highlight the innovations that people are doing in terms of distribution and storytelling, and also recognize that we now have access to tools which allow us to be more engaged, closer to our audience, and measure impact in a way that we never previously could. And fundamentally, it's worth saying, of course, that local news matters more than ever. We're having this conversation against a backdrop, particularly in the US, of fake news, record levels of distrust in journalism and the kind of media profession. And local journalists can be at the forefront of trying to change and address that. In many cases, local journalists will be the only journalist that most people will ever meet. That's really important in terms of representing the kind of wider journalistic community. It also means there's a responsibility to produce stories that are palpably true and relate to the kind of lives and existence that you have. And through that, you are able to not only restore greater trust, I believe, in the media, but also provide insights and intelligence which can then be distilled upwards to larger publications in metropolitan and big city areas who in the past have been perhaps more engaged with kind of local and regional communities than they are now because of their resourcing models. So I'm optimistic about the future. There are rocky roads ahead, but I'm delighted we're having this conversation, and there are lots of positive things to share today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Yes, I know that Vancouver Island, where I come from now, is about the same size as the UK, and we have several local media outlets. But last but not least, very excited to introduce Michelle Ferrier. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you to April for inviting us here for this very important conversation. I'm glad, actually, that I've gotten a chance to come to the end of this opening panel, because I will be talking about some of what's been happening in the U.S. as we look at the issues of local news and local journalism and the trajectory that we've taken towards this idea of community engagement to build that capacity at the local level. I'm Michelle Ferrier. I'm the principal investigator at Ohio University for the Media Deserts Project. I am also the founder of Trollbusters, a project that supports women journalists against online harassment. Thank you. And I'm also a former newspaper columnist as well as online community manager. So over 10 plus years ago, developed what some would call a hyper-local hub at a local newspaper in Florida, from which I got a lot of my experience and the impetus for the Media Deserts Project that I'll describe today, and then where we are on that project. The title of my presentation is Repairing the Breach. And I think that's an important perspective for us to have as we begin to look at how we might be able to repair the local media news environment in the US and elsewhere. The Media Deserts Project started over 7 years ago, where we began to look at and try and understand the changing media ecosystem. As you've already heard from some of my colleagues, from 2007, particularly in the US, with the US economic downturn, we saw a significant reduction in force, layoffs of journalists and personnel. We also saw the closure of over 120 newspapers across the US. And at the time, I was working at the Daytona Beach News Journal, working on a hyperlocal, an online community hub that brought together 12 different communities within a 2-county area in Florida, and attempting to try and use the digital portals as a way to basically coerce people into our hard news product. So we had 2 sites to our newspaper, the online news portal, and then the online community site that I ran, which covered some of the soft news and other types of things that help give people a sense of place, bring connection to the community, and help them understand a little bit more about their neighbors. And I think that's an important distinction that you'll see as I go through the presentation. So the Media Deserts Project was originally intended for 2 purposes. One was to illuminate the changing environment happening in the US at the local level and help us understand the impact of layoffs and the transitions that were happening economically on individual communities. Really helping us not only visualize that work, but make people aware, both the public as well as policymakers, and helping them understand what was happening down to the zip code level. And there is a reason, there's a political reason why we use the zip code level as a unit of measure. But there are other ways of slicing and dicing the data that we've collected over time. The flip side of the activity that we've been doing over the past 7 years is really looking at the action side of it. Once we know this information and are made aware that there are issues that are happening at the local level or a lack of news and information, how might we go about, through community engagement or media innovation and entrepreneurship at the local level, to create customized solutions that work for the demographics, psychographics, and geography of particular regions? And so much of the work that I've been doing is on these parallel tracks, working both on the awareness side as well as in action in the local level to attempt to seed experiments that we can learn from about what might be successful in other geographies. I'd like to first frame and understand a little bit more about why I call these media deserts, because I think you'll hear a lot about the term news deserts, but I think there's an important distinction. Media Deserts really looks at 3 different layers of what we call the media ecosystem. News Deserts really focuses on the content layer. Is there content available at the local level? Is there fresh daily news and information available to a community to be able to assess what's going on a daily basis, to be able to participate in political processes, and to be in action on the things that are important to that local community? And so News Deserts really focuses on content, but especially where I am in Ohio and where I've lived in other communities that tend to be very, very rural, we have issues of access, the conduit layers, and understanding whether if you have a mobile-first strategy, but yet 10 miles outside of the university where I teach, we have no mobile access. So the issues and struggles and concerns of large legacy media and becoming mobile first aren't going to help if we don't have the conduits to get that information to our local residents. And also the code layer. So the code layer deals with issues like algorithms and other types of things that may determine the type of information and news that you see at the local level, whether it's through Google News or other different types of aggregators of news and information. Those 3 layers are intertwined to create the local media ecosystem. And when we focus on just the content layer, we are losing the nuances of how we might be able to craft innovations at the local level that work for those communities. Oops. So what we have been doing is using GIS tools to map local media. We've been focusing primarily on daily newspapers, and our work through the spring and this summer will allow us to be able to not only focus on daily newspapers, we've also mapped what others have described as hyperlocal online news sites, fairly small geographic units, usually maybe a zip code level, where fresh news and information exists. As well as where it's lacking. And so we've been creating these maps for a couple of years, and you can see some of the changes in daily media. And it's modeled after some work that was done by the USDA probably over 6 years ago. I was working in the local food area and began to understand kind of the parallels of what was happening in the local food movement and how that paralleled what was happening in local news and information. Changes as well as what you might call artisan food creation. It's the same as the kind of hyperlocal content development that we saw happening across the US. So here's a 2016 map that shows you that primarily most of our media is concentrated on the coasts of the US. Our rural areas have maybe one daily newspaper outlet. This is a newspaper count map that shows you specifically the number of newspapers that exist in a community. And as many people have pointed out, the lack of data and or the incomplete nature of the data collection of circulation data, not only on our daily newspapers, but our hyperlocals, are unaudited to the main extent, making it difficult for us to be able to map and categorize these without lots of student labor. I'm sorry. So this count data, we're also looking at household circulation penetration data to understand not only does the newspaper exist, but how many people are actually receiving those subscriptions or bulk newspapers, et cetera, in a community. And you can see, although the colors are a little bit difficult on the projection system here, that many communities hover about 25% penetration. So with daily newspapers, with print, we find that there's a lack of access. Even with the existence of these papers where people are not getting their news and information from this area. Now, it's difficult on this map to be able to map their access to online news, information, et cetera. And so one of the ways that we're going to be building out this project this summer is an interactive map that allows you to be able to interrogate the data on various scales, whether that's designated market areas or whether that's zip code level or state level. And we're also going to be creating state level maps with indicators that help us understand the health of the ecosystem for communications and news and information at the state and local level. I want to talk a little bit about why the work that we're doing is so critical, particularly in the US, as we understand the political environment that we're in right now. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference when this tweet came across my feed. We have lived in a political environment in the US where over 10 years ago, I saw the rise of the kinds of alt-right or white supremacist groups in the US. However, I want to understand and really point to the damage that journalists themselves have done to our rural communities and communities of color, and why we saw the political backlash in the United States as these communities, both rural communities of color who have not had well-represented content in our news media. This was a tweet from a young woman who talked about her brother who had just been shot in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, we know there was historically issues in Ferguson, Missouri, but here she puts out a tweet on the day that her brother has died to say, I want to talk about my brother before the media gets a hold of him. And I think it's important for us to understand as media organizations, and as Damien had pointed out earlier, that for some communities, it's not going back to some golden age of journalism at the local level where we had good representation. For many rural communities and communities of color, journalists are equivalent to the police, viewed with suspicion, where drive-by journalism is committed upon populations, where they're considered zoo stories, where they're spectacles to be looked at in the newspaper, but the true representations of these communities have yet to be shown in our mainstream media newspapers. And so as we talk about what we need to do to be able to bolster our local news and information, we need to understand that first and foremost, we need to repair the trust that has been breached and the disenfranchisement that we've created with the lack of news and information and the lack of representation of diverse communities in our news and information. So one of the things that I've been doing as president of Journalism That Matters, an organization that for over 15 years has been bringing together diverse people in communities, journalists, technologists, librarians, urban planners, etc., to understand the unique geography and soil from which experimentation might spring, and help them be in conversation with each other to create the kinds of innovations that might work for their particular communities. And what we begin to do is look at those practices, as Damien hinted, that are transforming now in terms of the kinds of skills and knowledge that journalists should have going out into the workforce, and how they might work more authentically with communities in order to be able to repair this trust and be able to build the kinds of conversations that are true and authentic, and go beyond transactional to relational. What I mean by this is that we are in a click and metrics environment where it's about enhancing our product as journalists and journalism, instead of how we might be able to serve our communities better, to repair the kinds of relationships and breaches that we've seen in the US and our political environment. And so over the past several years, Journalism That Matters has been looking at the issue of community engagement, using dialogue and deliberation practices that come out of the communication studies area of media and communication studies, and understanding ways that journalists can operate differently at the local level in conversation and over time, instead of being episodic and diving in to cover a crime story or a police report, being there for the long haul to help the community see itself and understand itself and make itself visible, as well as help it look at what is the kind of news and information it needs to make better decisions at the local level and make choices about where resources might be allocated or people might spend their time to make their communities better. So I want to point to a couple of areas that we've talked about and have been working on. We've recently, I would say recently within the past 2 weeks, created a report, Journalism and Democracy, for Democracy and Communities, a new framework, from which we examined several local projects that have been looking at the local level and the idea of community engagement and authentic community engagement. And there are 3 principles, we call them guideposts, or the true north, that we're looking at. Nothing about us without us, meaning the community is integral to the creation, development, ideation of news and information at the local level, and or new media innovations that might serve the community. Speak truth to empower, that the work of journalists isn't just to expose or to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, but to actually help people be in action at the local level in ways that they might be able to grow their local environment. And the last is listening is our superpower, which I think speaks to the educators in the room. We train journalists for interviewing skills, and I think of the kind of listening that we do there as extractional. We're listening for quotes. We're listening to fill the narrative that we've already created about how we're going to write a story. The type of listening that I'm talking about at the local level now is a very different kind of listening, one that takes time and relationship building and understanding. And that superpower is one that we need to help train our students in being able to do that work. And so what we're talking about is building a civics communications ecosystem that goes beyond journalism to look at the information as well as the news needs of a community, and helping bring those together into a diagram where they're in dialogue with one another. I just wanted to help you see a little bit about some of what's required here. We had a conference just a week ago where we talked about elevating engagement at the University of Oregon and the community's desire to have this kind of deep relationship with journalists, not just for journalists to tell their stories, but to be a part of the story making and to ensure that their voices are represented authentically is key to the work that we have to do as journalists and communication organizations in the future.
just a sample of projects that are working out of legacy organizations as well as hyperlocals and public media that are using these deep kinds of engagement techniques, focus groups, dialogic practices where we're bringing people together to imagine and design new communications and civic ecosystems at the local level. So I hope I've given you some food for thought in thinking about ways that we might move beyond just building local news and information to really transforming the role of journalism in the 21st century to a partnership that builds communities through communication. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ferrier. Very powerful presentation. And now I'd like to invite all our panel members to sit up here at the table. And we do have about 10 minutes to take everybody's questions and have a bit of discussion. And again, if you would like to ask a question, the microphone is here to my right. Maybe I'll get us started. Moderator's privilege. Everybody today mentioned the lack of data available. And so I'd like to reframe that a little bit, and we're all here together as journalists and journalism educators and researchers. What can we do to be part of the solution to this lack of data that we're experiencing?
So in the US in particular, one of the frightening things that we've seen, whether it's our major organizations working in this area or elsewhere, is that we don't have very complete data regarding what's happening in our communities. And as you've heard from some of the presentations today, it takes some labor to be able to clean that data and make it available. As well as in our hyperlocal environment where we really lack the auditing necessary to understand what coverage they're doing in communities and the content analysis to be able to understand how we might be able to see whether or not, even in the presence of those media organizations, whether they're actually covering their communities totally. And so part of what we're attempting to do is create some new ways of actually auditing and monitoring the scope of hyperlocal media as well as other online media outlets, not just recognizing their presence, but looking at the reach and where they're actually providing content to communities.
Thank you. Please.
Hey, thank you. Is this on? Oh, good, good. A bit of context, and by way of, I guess it's more observation than question. Once upon a time, I was a geographer, and I also live in one of the assigned news deserts, the Kawartha Lakes. It occurred to me that the three places you identified as being top of your list Z-score-wise, I think it was, what, Kamloops, Peterborough, and Thunder Bay. From a geographic point of view, those three areas are highly nucleated. And I think that observation was borne out in the maps we saw of similar kind of news deserts in the United States, too. Thank you so much, by the way, for using the word geography several times in your presentation. Okay, the comment is this. Perhaps it's in the future component of your digital checklist, but as a resident of Kawartha Lakes, I know that there are issues of what you might call social affiliation. In Kamloops and in Thunder Bay, I very much doubt that no more than perhaps 1 or 2% of the population would migrate for up to 6 months of the year to Florida. In the Kawartha Lakes, there is a significant minority of population who migrate for 5 to 6 months of the year. They feel no real affiliation with the region as such, and therefore, why should I bother be concerning myself with what's going on in the region? Equally, I think if you look at areas like Oakville and Brampton, people who reside there may spend perhaps, 8 to 10 hours of their 24 actually in those communities, but the rest, the focus is on the DVP, on the Gardner, on Union Station, on those dam construction. I mean, that's their focus, Toronto or wherever they happen to be working. So they too don't really have much incentive to be totally cognizant of what you might call local news. That's an observation, not a question, but thank you.
Thank you. April?
Yeah, we are going to look at the issue of proximity to a major media center, because I think that that is something we need to explore a little further. And the issue of people the big news comes out of Toronto, and people, their news allegiance tends to be directed in that direction, I think, in some of the more suburban ridings. And yes, that's not the case in places that are more isolated and outside of the sphere of a major media metropolis. So that's one of the things that definitely we're going to look at on our checklist.
Thank you. Please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for a great starting panel. Hard to shake the fog of a Saturday morning, but there you go. So I have a couple of quick comments and questions, and I will be quick because it's a room full of journalists, so I expect the line to get longer, but maybe the time is short. One thing from Damien Radcliffe that I appreciated that you said, and was also echoed by Dr. Michelle, was the idea of local news being the glue that keeps communities together, and then the sort of the maybe a contradictory kind of point that Dr. Michelle made was that for diverse communities, communities of color, there is a real trust breakdown, let's just put it that way. In fact, just to plug my panel tomorrow at 9 o'clock, we're going to be talking about how Muslim communities have been addressing this, because we're going to have Muslim journalists talking about how they have been trying to sort of bridge that divide and build trust. But my question specifically for Damien first, and then for Dr. Michelle, was for Damien. You mentioned in London that when they were trying to have 2 hours of local news, that there was some advocacy about just keeping it down to 1 hour. And I wanted to try to understand why, because if we'd heard previously that 50, 60 years ago it was possible to have a television station in a rural area with a small population, and there was a business case for it. I'm still not clear as to why it doesn't make money to tell stories about the people in your own community. I still don't get it, so I hope that I'm going to get it by the end of this weekend. And for Dr. Michelle, just again thinking about this idea of journalists as sort of almost drive-by journalism, this idea of drive-by journalism. What is the solution to that? In 30 seconds?
For you.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about London, UK, not London, Canada. That kind of advocacy actually came from the operator itself. So the people who owned the license, they won the license with the promise of doing 2 hours a day. And as is often the case, having secured the license, they then went back and said, actually, can we reduce those obligations that we promised that we would deliver? And I think really the reasons for that were twofold. Firstly, they found it much harder to make money than they thought they were going to. And as we know, making content, and particularly TV content, remains expensive, even with in this digital age. And secondly, and kind of partly aligned to that, they struggled to find an audience. There isn't a habit of Londoners going on their TVs to watch local news. They still pick up the paper, the Evening Standard, which is now free, no longer paid for, and they can find plenty of free information elsewhere online. And of course, because it's the capital of the UK, in many cases, national media covers local, London stories incredibly well. So there isn't necessarily both the habit or perhaps the need for that level of content. If that license had been made available 30, 40 years previously, we might be having a very different conversation, but arguably it was all too late in the day.
So to the point of the drive-by journalism, I really wanted to stress that there is no golden age. I think we have been engaging, at least in the U.S., especially with the kind of commercial model that we have, in a kind of class journalism, where our commercial model has forced, in order to make a profit, our media entities into the most lucrative markets, where we have high income and high education level population. And so we see those deserts, and especially with the hyperlocals, we see them replicating those same patterns in order to become viable, sustainable entities. And so how do you go beyond that drive-by journalism if your entity is focused in an area that's geographically removed from these others by just sending or parachuting your journalists into that area? The other issue that compounds this is that our diversity numbers in our legacy media are declining. And so the number of journalists of color that work for print media or broadcast or any of the other media outlets continues to decline or stay stagnant, despite 20 years of efforts by our national organizations to be able to change that number. So while that seems doom and gloom, I think the work that I've been doing on media deserts down to the zip code level, it really helps to focus our attention and resources. For example, one example that we're testing in the US is a concept of geotagged scholarships, where we are hoping to draw students from communities who lack access to news and information because we've been able to find those geographies, bring them into our journalism institutions, train them and provide them with a degree in how to produce the work, and then put them back into those communities for a period of time along the lines of media. It's a media core model along the lines of AmeriCorps and other different types of national interventions in the US that have done the very same thing of trying to build the capacity for news and information in local areas. So that's a small area where you have journalists that are in and of the communities in which they're reporting from. And in order to avoid those kinds of drive-by journalism or zoo stories, I think we must have a much greater focus on the diversity of our staffs and the people who are creating and producing the news.
So it's 20 after 10 now. So April, you think one more question, and then I'll ask the rest of you. I know this is a great discussion, but our panelists will be available during break to talk to you. So for our last question, please.
Good morning, and thank you to all of you for excellent presentations this morning. My question actually is Daniel Radcliffe. I'm wondering if you could...
Daniel
sorry,
Radcliffe is the guy who plays Harry Potter.
Yeah.
It happens all the time.
Your glasses
really
are
does.
square, not
Yeah.
round. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on the point that you mentioned concerning the BBC, and I think you called it top slicing, and money being taken from the licensing fee going towards different initiatives, including supporting commercial journalism.
Yes. Yeah, so this is a relatively new phenomenon that we've seen over the course of really this current decade. And really, I think it stems from two things. I mean, one is increased lobbying from commercial organizations who in the past have said, get off our lawn, to the BBC, who are now saying, actually, help us out. You have guaranteed income and revenue, and we don't. So they've completely changed their dynamic and want some of that revenue. And you also have a Conservative government who are philosophically quite antagonistic and anti the BBC, much more in thrall of the free market economics, and who are therefore willing to have those conversations about taking money away, for example, to pay for local TV. So £15 million taken away from that. The BBC was also obligated to buy content from local TV providers and to retransmit it. And then, as we've also seen over the course of the last year and starting this year, this creation of a new kind of bank of journalists who are producing content for commercial outlets and for BBC outlets in areas like the kind of sort of traditional civic reporting that commercial outlets used to do. But now they're completely disincentivized to do it if they can go cap in hand to the government and then in turn the BBC and have that service provided for them. I think it's a very dangerous precedent, because then it allows commercial organizations to say, we're only going to cover the beats that are commercially viable, and we want public money to cover everything else. And I think that's potentially a dangerous route to go down.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, for a very productive and generative first panel. I'd like to thank April Lindgren, Colette Bryn, Damien Radcliffe, and Michelle Ferrier. And we're going to have our second panel in this room at 10:45. But until then, there's coffee and goodies out there. Thank you all for coming, and have a great conference.
Great.